Let me start by saying that NATO, of course, as it has been since its start in 1949, has been and is about the defense of alliance territory. And I think there's no need to start this discussion anew. There is the solidarity clause, there's the Washington Treaty. NATO is prepared for eventualities, which I do not expect to happen. So let us not start a debate on Article 5, because some people, if we do that publicly, might start to wonder, is there something wrong with Article 5? And my answer would be no, there's definitely nothing wrong with Article 5. But there's more. And that is reacting to President Ilves, to Tom. NATO, of course, has a great responsibility in area, but certainly is trying to come to grips with a number of what we call in our horrible jargon asymmetric challenges. I mentioned them very quickly. Of course, international terrorism is still haunting our global village. We are confronted with failed states, we are confronted with regional conflicts, and we are confronted, in other words, with the choice between engagement and indifference. In Afghanistan, the Allies decided to engage with the United Nations mandate. And as you know, that is not only a difficult mission in the terrain on the ground, it is also a difficult mission against sometimes very critical public opinion in the nations providing the forces. Why are you defending your key values at the Hindu Kush? When I grew up, the Fulda Gap was an easier notion than the Hindu Kush, I can tell you. Nevertheless, we are there, and I think we should be there. May I also mention, it has been mentioned this morning before, may I also mention climate change? It has definitely skewed implications. If I look at the high north, the Arctic, for instance, I'll mention it briefly, and the consequences of climate change, and that's not only about having flags on the seabed, but there are certainly, as a consequence of climate change, security implications. I could add that nuclear proliferation is reaching a tipping point, with Iran edging closer to the bomb and North Korea threatening to reverse its denuclearization commitments. Again, no need to explain to President Ilves, cyber attacks have taken place and are likely to happen even more often in the future. And finally, the scramble for natural resources has put a premium on energy security. And I mention intentionally energy security, also in energy. There is, of course, a major security element. Now, one might argue, ladies and gentlemen, over which of these challenges constitute first-order issues and which are secondary. But we all agree, I hope at least, that these challenges overtax the ability of any single nation and any single international institution. So cooperation is a strategic imperative. I take Thierry de Montbrial's point. Thierry, I take your point about the important role of the nation state. That will never leave us, that will never go away, and should never go away. But cooperation between nations and institutions is of great importance. Why? Let's take my institution, NATO. It was created in a different era. And I'll certainly not argue that all the efforts and investment to adapt NATO to a 21st century environment has been completely successful up till today. But institutions remain our most effective instrument for generating consensus and converting that consensus into common action. And that is why, from a NATO perspective, I'll not stop in promoting as close a relationship between NATO and the European Union as we can have. We have some waves from time to time in the relationship, but I think I can follow the Président de la République Française when he says that the word complementarity should be the key word in that relationship. And let me add that as NATO Secretary General, I'm very much and strongly in favor of a European Union also being its own actor in the field of defense and security. I think it's in NATO interest if that development continues. I signed with Secretary General Ban Ki-moon 2 weeks ago in New York an MOU between NATO and the United Nations. Apart from an Article 5 operation in the Mediterranean, all NATO's operations and missions are taking place under direct United Nations mandate or with the blessing of the United Nations. I spoke to African Union President Kikwete in New York. Why? Because after what NATO did in Darfur in assisting the African Union, there might well be a need for NATO to train the African Union standby force and being useful there. In other words, civilian and military institutions must work together, and they must, here's the word again, complement each other. So far so good, you might say. If we agree on all of this, what could possibly go wrong? Unfortunately, several new developments challenge this broad consensus that I have just tried to describe, and hence our collective ability to cope. I mentioned three trends. The first is a tendency of some key players to challenge an international order that they perceive as, quote-unquote, Western-dominated and disadvantaged to their own interests. We see this in Russia, and we see this in parts of Asia. The Russian concept of sovereign democracy is, of course, an attempt to have a successful capitalist economy, yet with a carefully controlled public space. And some Asian countries challenge the Western notion that economic success and political freedoms must inevitably go together. They try to prove that the market can work without freedom. I'm firmly convinced that separating a free market economy, I should almost add this morning in the classic sense, seeing what is happening in and with the free market economy, but I'm firmly convinced that separating that free market economy and freedom will ultimately prove unworkable. I think those notions are driven by short-term interests rather than by long-term strategic consideration.